nearly 2 million dead. 4 years were enough for the new regime to destroy a society from the inside out. On April 17, 1975, the Khmer Rouge overthrew the government in Phnom Penh. General Lon Nol's military forces collapsed. Soldiers in black uniforms took the intersections, and the bustling streets of the capital emptied out. In the spring of 1975, Cambodia had roughly 7.5 million people. Almost a quarter of them would perish. History knew mass killings, as Nazi camps and Soviet gulags targeted specific political or ethnic groups. Mao's famine starved millions through economic failure. But the Cambodian terror followed a different logic. The nation turned against its own flesh. The state aimed its weapons inward. The regime wiped out its own core demographic. By the time the Vietnamese army ousted the leaders in 1979, the landscape was unrecognizable. Troops surveyed the mass graves. They needed a new word to describe a country that had cannibalized its own citizens. The Vietnamese military officially classified the slaughter as an autogenocide. This internal slaughter was orchestrated by a complete phantom. 2 men stared at a grainy official photograph of the supreme leader, suddenly recognizing their own flesh and blood. Until 1976, the bleeding country did not even know the actual name of the architect tearing their society apart, when he finally introduced himself as Pol Pot. The shadow had no face. The state demanded blind obedience to an anonymous entity, ensuring that deep social paranoia penetrated every forced labor camp across Cambodia. He was born Saloth Sar in May 1925, but he buried his personal history under layers of militant deception. During the initial rural insurgency, the former teacher operated exclusively under obscure pseudonyms like Brother Number 1 and Grand Uncle. Millions of citizens were sent to their deaths without ever seeing the man dictating their execution. It was not until the middle of 1978 that his own brothers discovered his identity through that censored newspaper portrait. A nation of 7 million was methodically dismantled under the command of a ghost. Even after the eventual collapse of his government, the cultivated veil of secrecy remained immensely difficult to pierce. The dictator deliberately falsified his own timeline, repeatedly claiming a birth year of 1928 to obscure his early French Indochina records. Biographer David Chandler spent years untangling these calculated bureaucratic contradictions to reconstruct a factual narrative. Decades later, historians are still rewriting the institutional historical archives simply to establish his true age. Behind the missing dates, the peasant leader's origin hides a glaring paradox. The agrarian architect had direct blood ties to the royal palace in Phnom Penh. Official propaganda molded him into a destitute farmer. Yet Saloth Sar grew up surrounded by unattainable luxury, insulated from the starvation that would later define his rule. North Korea broadcasted the first fabricated biography to the outside world. Foreign media constructed an ideal proletarian hero. They erased his family wealth. They ignored the massive private estates. But the physical reality of his childhood contradicted this manufactured communist myth. Pen Saloth, his father, owned vast and profitable rice fields. Heavy red clay tiles covered the roof of their rural home. The hot sun baked the expensive terracotta. Next door, ordinary villagers lived in straw huts. A solid tiled roof stood against rotting thatched cabins. In the 1920s, a tiled roof marked the highest local elite. Barely a fraction of a percent of the population could afford such permanent materials. His cousin, Meek, walked the restricted halls of sovereign power. She had a son with King Sisawath Monivong. She remained a royal fixture well into the 1970s. The government buried these aristocratic roots under state censorship. Pyongyang broadcasts claimed the dictator found his zeal as a poor local student. They deliberately omitted one geographic fact. The the future communist received his education in the very heart of imperial Paris. Returning from Europe in the 1950s, the future dictator stepped into a Phnom Penh classroom with a wide, disarming smile. He stood before his students as an engaging history teacher. Those who sat in his classes remembered an honest figure who communicated with remarkable clarity. Colleagues found him effortlessly charming, and one acquaintance noted an immediate connection upon their first meeting. The man who would soon orchestrate mass murder navigated the capital wearing the mask of an affable intellectual. Decades after his time in the classroom, researchers struggled to reconcile this gentle exterior with the architect of the killing fields. Biographer David Chandler spent years analyzing the dictator's behavior. He tried to determine if the persistent kindness was a calculated weapon. Even political allies who defected from the regime hesitated to blame him personally, swayed by his carefully maintained public demeanor. Propaganda photographs captured his trademark toothy grin, presenting a perfect citizen rather than an executioner. The dissonance between the smiling educator and the tyrant haunted those seeking his true motives. In 1997, shortly before his death, journalist Nate Thayer secured a rare 2-hour interview. Thayer sought to penetrate the psychological layers, hoping to expose the egotist hiding behind the ideological facade. Yet the extensive conversation yielded no clear answers. Historians were left with a repertoire of practiced masks. Nobody saw the real face. Shedding his bourgeois upbringing, Salat Sar found a new, cold foundation in the texts of Joseph Stalin. In the late 1940s, the future dictator sat in cramped Parisian apartments alongside fellow Cambodian students. Yang Seri and other devoted Marxists gathered beneath a portrait of the Soviet leader. The smell of cheap tobacco and aging paper filled these small rooms. Here, young men debated revolution and studied political manifestos far into the night. Their discussions quickly moved past basic Marxist theory. Stalin's The History of Communism became their primary manual for state building. The group absorbed this text without questioning its origins. Stalin wrote it during the internal purges of 1937 and 38. 750,000 people died in the Great Terror. For the young Cambodians in Paris, this death toll was not a warning, it was an instruction. They viewed mass extermination as a legitimate tool to cleanse a society. Traitors and opportunists had to be eradicated to build a pure state. The ideology of future genocide took shape across these foreign student desks decades earlier. Following the Soviet template, Salat Sar eventually abandoned his birth name entirely. Stalin had chosen a title meaning steel. The Cambodian student took a different approach. He adopted the pseudonym Pol Pot, a common name typical of the local agrarian peasantry. After 3 months of continuous artillery fire, soldiers entered the capital, and the modern era vanished. The ideological theories forged within cramped Parisian apartments had waited 20 years for this exact moment. Returning to Cambodia in 1953, the former student aimed to construct a pure Marxist-Leninist utopia. He spent a decade organizing quietly before government pressure forced him to vanish into the northern jungles in 1963. There, isolated beneath the canopy, the movement consolidated its military strength. The balance of power shifted following General Lon Nol's military coup in March 1970. Civil war consumed the countryside, driving hundreds of thousands of refugees straight into the capital to escape the bombing. By 1975, Phnom Penh held a massively swollen population, turning the impending social collapse into a human catastrophe. The final offensive concluded on April 17, 1975, when the Khmer Rouge seized the overrun city. That afternoon, they proclaimed Year Zero. This declaration initiated the instantaneous erasure of Cambodian culture. As journalist John Pilger documented in 1979, the new regime dismantled the basic elements of human existence. Money lost its value overnight, medicine was discarded, and schools were permanently shuttered. The state abolished religious practices and outlawed the fundamental bonds of family. Physical labor became the sole permitted human activity. Armed cadres then issued the order to begin the forced evacuation of all Cambodian cities. The first practical step of Year Zero was the physical eradication of urban civilization. Cadres politely promised to guard unlocked apartments, sending 2 million residents into the fields where no return existed. French author François Polchot watched the eviction unfold. Soldiers knocked on doors. They calmly asked families to step back 10 meters, blaming an imminent United States bombing. The uniformed men promised to protect left-behind belongings. There was no American strike. Within 72 hours, 2 million people marched out of Phnom Penh. This equaled the total evacuation of modern Paris entirely on foot in 3 days. Endless crowds walked toward the central Cambodian plain. The suffocating heat of the flatlands baked the exiles as they built primitive huts from dirt. The state now controlled biology, language, and basic human connection. Workers were forbidden to use the word sleep. They were only permitted to say they needed to rest. The party viewed sleep as a selfish act of individual laziness. Intimacy faced equally rigid quotas. Husbands and wives saw each other exactly once a month. The committee allowed this brief contact only to maintain the national birth rate. 1.5 million victims marked the start of the genocide. 12 years. In these agricultural camps, death quickly became the primary tool of social engineering. Before the purge, the national life expectancy stood at 39.8 years. By 1976, it collapsed to 12. This figure marks the lowest average lifespan ever recorded in any sovereign state in modern human history. The mass executions began on May 20th. The selection process defied logic. Armed militants set up roadblocks along the dirt paths, listening closely for any trace of a foreign accent. They searched pockets for ballpoint pens. The confiscation of a simple ink pen nearly cost writer François Polchot his life. Soldiers rode through the crowds. The roar of stolen motorcycles drowned out the crying. Their wrists clinked with dozens of looted watches. The patrols looked for one specific facial feature. Wearing eyeglasses equaled a death sentence. To the regime, poor eyesight meant a person read books. Reading meant education. The slightest trace of intellect guaranteed an execution. Cultural markers killed faster than political charges. Firing squads targeted Buddhist teachers and dragged Cham Muslims from their homes. They hunted citizens with Chinese, Thai, or Vietnamese heritage. The slaughter spared no one who failed to fit the new agricultural standard. Writer Dith Pran coined a term for these execution sites. The world later learned it through Sidney Schanberg's dispatches. They called them the killing fields. Across the countryside, professionals and technicians filled mass graves. Vietnamese troops finally overthrew the government and took control of the territory in January 1979. The chaos across the rural killing fields was merely part of a broader design. The most methodical atrocities occurred behind locked doors at S21. Inside a former classroom, guards tightened a metal vise over a prisoner's hand. A loudspeaker outside blared the national anthem. This facility was originally Tuol Sleng High School, built to educate children. Barbed wire covered the concrete balconies, turning the campus into a death camp. A survivor named Mr. Peg experienced the daily reality of this institution. Interrogators struck his head with a heavy wooden stave 50 times. He eventually collapsed onto the floor. The guards clamped his injured hand inside the vise and tore off his fingernails. They retrieved a bottle of medical rubbing alcohol from a nearby cabinet. They did not use this liquid for disinfection, but poured it onto his raw fingertips to magnify the pain. The sharp scent of alcohol soaking into torn tissue filled the room. This routine sadism swallowed thousands without a trace. Out of 20,000 people detained at S21, only 7 prisoners made it out alive. The regime embraced this violence as the foundation of their new society. The official national anthem openly celebrated the ongoing massacre. The lyrics declared that bright red blood covered the towns and plains of Kampuchea, changing into unrelenting hatred and resolute struggle. While guards executed prisoners to the rhythm of that national anthem, Salat Sar traveled abroad for international recognition. The regime stripped all modern technology from its population, yet the dictator landed at the Beijing airport on a modern jet airliner. It was September 28, 1977. 100,000 people waited on the tarmac. This massive crowd was strictly mobilized by the Chinese state. Such highly choreographed rallies defined totalitarian diplomatic visits of that era. Premier Hua Guofeng greeted him with flowers and honors. He publicly praised the Cambodian reliance on the masses and armed struggle. Days later, they flew to Pyongyang. President Kim Il-sung personally decorated the visiting leader. State television broadcast the official ceremony across North Korea. Kim praised him as a dedicated patriot and a good farmhand. At home, millions of isolated citizens simply starved. Abroad, Allied governments formally celebrated an architect of mass murder. Following these diplomatic events, state agencies published the first official photographs of the dictator. Those Beijing photographs from 1977 remained the regime's only public face for 2 decades. An American journalist tracked him to the jungle, discovering a complete lack of remorse. How did the leader explain empty cities and millions of corpses? He claimed he was defending the country against a Vietnamese invasion. By late 1997, Nate Thayer found him under house arrest near the Thai border. The stifling tropical heat pressed down on the wooden property, yet the architect of mass murder sat at ease. He offered a charming, grandfatherly smile, displaying the friendly demeanor of a man who had once ordered cities cleared. Wiping out a quarter of the population translated to roughly 1.5 to 2 million deaths in under 4 years. He sat comfortably on a wooden chair, maintaining a pleasant disposition while discussing the mass killings. He acknowledged minor mistakes, but refused to express genuine remorse. The Khmer Rouge, he insisted, had been a righteous force, acting for the greater good. When pressed about the S-21 extermination center, he simply shook his head. He denied knowing anything about the facility. Thayer tried multiple approaches to extract a single word of guilt. The elderly man deflected every inquiry with polite dishonesty. In his isolated perspective, the victims were casualties of national defense, not targets of an internal purge. The aging dictator never recognized the destruction. He saw no crimes. This unwavering belief in his own righteousness lasted until the spring of 1998. The former dictator spent his final months isolated under house arrest. His own comrades had sentenced him to a life term. On April 15, 1998, his failing heart finally stopped. Thai detectives arrived at the remote jungle compound. They examined the body and took photographs to document the scene. Guards soaked the fragile corpse in formaldehyde to delay the rapid tropical decomposition. No international court ever heard his testimony. Back in 1979, he had fled into these exact jungles to start a 20-year guerrilla war against justice. He outran the law until the very end. The United Nations Tribunal for Khmer Rouge crimes only began its work in 2006. That was 8 full years after the main accused had already died. Instead of a courtroom, he received a remarkably primitive funeral. Soldiers lifted the simple wooden coffin. They dropped it onto old car tires and discarded rubbish. A guard struck a match. The man who escaped the law burned in thick, foul-smelling black smoke atop a mound of automotive garbage.